Another week. Another headline. Another pastor has fallen. This one had affairs with multiple women in his congregation. That one embezzled millions from church funds. Another spiritually abused his staff while preaching grace from the pulpit. One more covered up sexual misconduct for years, protecting predators while claiming to protect the flock. The names change, the denominations vary, but the pattern is the same. Men who stood before thousands preaching about holiness were living double lives. Leaders who taught about integrity were manipulating and controlling. Pastors who spoke about Jesus were building personal empires. And when they fell, when the affairs were exposed, when the financial fraud was uncovered, when the abuse came to light, they took people's faith down with them. Entire congregations shattered. Families destroyed. Young people who grew up in these churches walked away from Christianity entirely, convinced that if their trusted spiritual leaders were frauds, maybe the whole thing was a fraud. This isn't a story about one bad pastor. This is an epidemic. In the past decade alone, dozens of prominent megachurch pastors have fallen from public disgrace. Sexual misconduct, financial fraud, spiritual abuse, emotional manipulation. The list keeps growing. But here's the question no one wants to ask. Is this just about individual moral failures? Or is there something deeper, something systemic, that's creating an environment where pastors fall with such devastating regularity? What if the way we've built modern church leadership is fundamentally broken? What if we've created a system that almost guarantees these failures? What if the scandal isn't just that pastors fell, but that we set them up to fall? This is the story of why so many pastors are falling. It's uncomfortable. It's painful. But if we want the church to be different, we have to be willing to look honestly at what went wrong. To understand why pastors are falling, we need to understand how pastoral ministry changed over the past 50 years. For most of Christian history, pastors were servants of local congregations. They knew their members personally. They lived modest lives on modest salaries. They were accountable to denominational structures and local elders. Their authority was limited. Their visibility was local. But in the late 20th century, something changed. The megachurch movement exploded. Television and radio gave pastors platforms to reach millions. Church growth became the measure of success, and pastors transformed from local shepherds into celebrity leaders. The megachurch model created a new kind of pastor, the CEO pastor, the visionary leader, the charismatic personality who could draw crowds, raise millions, and build empires. Success was measured in numbers: attendance, buildings, budgets, baptisms. The megachurch movement fundamentally changed pastoral ministry. Pastors became entrepreneurs, fundraisers, brand managers. The skills that made someone successful looked more like corporate leadership than spiritual shepherding. And that created vulnerabilities that didn't exist in traditional pastoral models. With size came power. Megachurch pastors controlled massive budgets, sometimes tens of millions of dollars. They made decisions affecting hundreds of staff. They shaped the spiritual lives of thousands. They became celebrities within Christian culture. And with celebrity came adoration. Congregants didn't just respect their pastors, they idolized them. They hung on every word. They defended them against criticism. They saw them as God's specially anointed servants who could do no wrong. One former megachurch member described it: "Our pastor was like a rock star. People lined up to meet him. If you questioned anything he said or did, you were seen as rebellious, as attacking God's anointed. There was this aura of untouchability around him." This celebrity status created isolation. Megachurch pastors had few genuine relationships. They were surrounded by staff who depended on them for employment, by congregants who idealized them, by boards who often rubber-stamped their decisions. When you're the most powerful person in your organization, when everyone depends on you or worships you, who tells you the truth? Who challenges you? Who holds you accountable? Often the answer is no one. The falls follow patterns. Different details, but similar trajectories. It often starts with success. Pastor builds a thriving church. Thousands attend. Money pours in. Buildings expand. The pastor's influence grows. Media opportunities multiply. Book deals happen. Speaking engagements across the country. The pastor becomes a brand. And somewhere in that success, something shifts. The pastor who started out genuinely wanting to serve God begins to believe his own press. The praise, the adoration, the success, it creates a sense of being special, chosen, above ordinary rules. One pastor who fell and later spoke about his experience described it. I started to believe I was indispensable, that God needed me, that the rules that applied to everyone else didn't apply to me because I was doing such important work. It was pride disguised as godly confidence. The isolation intensifies. Real friendships erode. The pastor's schedule is consumed by church demands. Home life suffers. Marriage becomes strained. The pastor feels lonely despite being surrounded by people. And in that isolation and stress, temptation finds an opening. For some pastors, it's sexual sin, an inappropriate relationship with a staff member, an affair with someone seeking counseling, an addiction to pornography that escalates. The very position that's supposed to represent moral authority becomes the cover for moral failure. For others, it's financial corruption, church credit cards for personal expenses, diverting building funds to personal accounts, lavish lifestyles funded by the sacrificial giving of struggling congregants, justifying it as deserved compensation for their hard work and importance. What's striking about pastoral falls is how often there's a disconnect between the public persona and private reality. The pastor preaching about sexual purity is having affairs. The pastor teaching about financial stewardship is embezzling funds. The pastor preaching grace is spiritually abusing his staff. The double life becomes normalized through layers of self-deception and enabling systems. And when these failures are discovered, the cover-up often compounds the damage. Rather than confess and seek help, many pastors lie. They manipulate. They use their spiritual authority to silence victims or accusers. They claim they're under spiritual attack. They present themselves as victims of gossip or persecution. Church boards, invested in protecting the church's reputation and financial stability, often enable the cover-up. They make the problem go away quietly. They pay settlements with non-disclosure agreements. They move the pastor to a different role or recommend him to another church. They prioritize the institution over justice for victims. The pattern is devastatingly common. A young woman reports sexual harassment by a pastor. Church leaders investigate, but the pastor is persuasive, powerful, beloved. They believe him over her. Years later, more victims come forward. The pattern was there all along, but the system protected the abuser and silenced the abused. Did fame replace faith? For many fallen pastors, the honest answer seems to be yes. The mission shifted from serving God to building a kingdom, from shepherding people to managing a brand, from humility to celebrity. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Individual moral failures don't explain why this keeps happening with such regularity. There's something systemic at work. Modern church culture has adopted corporate structures and celebrity culture in ways that create environments where abuse and misconduct flourish. We've built churches like businesses, pastors like CEOs, and faith like a brand. And that creates predictable problems. In corporate culture, success is measured by growth and profit. The CEO who delivers results is protected, celebrated, given more power and resources. The board exists to support the CEO's vision. Dissent is discouraged. Loyalty is rewarded. When churches adopt this model, they create the same dynamics. The pastor who grows the church is given more authority, less accountability, and increasing isolation. The elders or board become supporters of the pastor's vision rather than genuine accountability partners. Staff members who raise concerns are seen as disloyal and are removed. One of the most toxic phrases in modern church culture is, "Don't touch God's anointed." It's used to shut down any criticism or accountability of pastoral leadership. It treats pastors as if they're above reproof, as if questioning their decisions or behavior is questioning God Himself. That's not biblical leadership, that's a cult of personality. The Bible paints a very different picture of leadership. Jesus washed His disciples' feet. He said, "The greatest among you must be the servant of all." He warned against religious leaders who loved places of honor, who laid heavy burdens on others while exempting themselves, who did their deeds to be seen by people. The early church had plural leadership, mutual accountability, and structures to prevent any one person from having unchecked power. Elders were to be humble, not given to drunkenness, not lovers of money, not violent but gentle, managing their own families well as evidence of their fitness to lead. But modern megachurch culture often inverts these values. We celebrate the bold, visionary leader. We excuse character flaws if the church is growing. We measure success by numbers rather than faithfulness. We create rock star pastors and then act surprised when they develop rock star egos and rock star moral failures. The financial structures enable corruption. In many megachurches, the pastor controls or heavily influences his own compensation. There's little transparency about how money is spent. Board members are often chosen for loyalty rather than independence. Financial accountability is minimal. One church consultant noted, "I've seen churches where the pastor's salary is 10 or 20 times what the median church member earns, where he has discretionary funds he doesn't have to account for, where he uses church resources for personal benefit, and when anyone questions it, they're told to trust God's anointed." This isn't just about money, it's about power. Unchecked power corrupts. And when spiritual authority is combined with financial control, personal charisma, and celebrity status, the conditions for abuse and corruption are nearly perfect. When a pastor falls, the damage extends far beyond one leader's reputation. Entire communities are traumatized. Church members feel betrayed. They trusted this person with their spiritual formation, their children, their resources, their most vulnerable moments. Learning that the person they trusted was living a lie creates a crisis of faith that can take years to recover from, if they recover at all. One woman whose pastor fell to sexual scandal described her experience. "I felt stupid. I had defended him when others raised concerns. I had given money we couldn't really afford because he said God was calling us to sacrifice. I had brought my friends to that church, and all of it was built on lies. I haven't been able to trust a church leader since." For victims of pastoral abuse, the damage is even more severe. Sexual abuse, spiritual manipulation, financial exploitation, these aren't just betrayals of trust. They're weaponizations of sacred authority. They're soul wounds that can take a lifetime to heal. And tragically, many victims report that when they tried to report abuse, the church sided with the pastor. They were blamed, silenced, threatened, forced to sign non-disclosure agreements, told they were trying to destroy God's work. The institutional church's response to abuse has often been more concerned with protecting reputation than pursuing justice. And that secondary betrayal, being failed by the institution that was supposed to protect them, can be more damaging than the original abuse. Young people who grew up in these churches often walk away entirely. They conclude that if this is what Christianity produces, if Christian leaders are hypocrites, if churches protect abusers, if faith is just a brand, then they want nothing to do with it. But there are also stories of restoration. Pastors who fell, genuinely repented, did the hard work of counseling and accountability, and rebuilt their lives in humility. Not returning to celebrity status, but serving quietly, honestly, with genuine transformation. Churches that responded to scandal by implementing real accountability structures, creating safe reporting mechanisms for abuse, prioritizing victims over reputation, and choosing transparency over cover-up. So why did so many pastors fall? Not because they were uniquely evil, but because we built systems that almost guaranteed it. We created celebrity pastors, isolated them with power, removed accountability, measured success by numbers rather than character, and then acted shocked when pride, corruption, and abuse followed. The good news is that systems can change. Churches can choose different models of leadership: plural eldership, genuine accountability, financial transparency, limited terms for senior leaders, independent boards, safe reporting channels for concerns, prioritizing character over charisma. Congregations can stop idolizing pastors and start seeing them as fellow sinners in need of grace and accountability. They can ask hard questions about money, about power, about how decisions are made. They can refuse to accept "don't touch God's anointed" as an excuse for avoiding accountability. And church leaders can choose humility over celebrity, service over empire building, transparency over image management. They can build genuine friendships outside their churches. They can submit to real accountability. They can measure success by faithfulness rather than numbers. The falls of so many pastors are tragic, but they don't have to be the end of the story. They can be the beginning of something better, a church that looks less like corporate America and more like Jesus, a church where leadership means service, where power means accountability, where success means faithfulness. Perhaps the fall of pastors isn't the end of faith, but the beginning of accountability. The beginning of a church that's more interested in being faithful than being famous. The beginning of leadership that looks like a shepherd rather than a CEO. The beginning of a community that protects the vulnerable rather than the powerful. That's the church Jesus called us to be. And maybe these painful falls are the catalyst we need to finally become it.